In this series, and exclusive to this channel, you'll hear a word-for-word account of what the jury were told after hearing 9 months of evidence during Lucy Letby's original trial. Now, with so much harmful misinformation currently being spread online and in mainstream publications surrounding this case, this series seeks to provide for the first time exactly what transpired in court. That means no ill-informed commentary or any bias, simply the evidence as presented during the trial itself. This video has been made possible by the purchasing of court-approved transcripts, further details of which can be found in the video description box below. What you'll hear next is a detailed summary of the prosecution's case against Lucy Letby. This took place at Manchester Crown Court and was conducted by Nicholas Johnson, KC. When she gave evidence, Lucy Letby claimed to you that she doesn't really remember Child D. She said that to you because that's what she told the police in interview. And she said that in interview because she thought that the absence of her name from the paperwork for Child D gave her the opportunity for plausible deniability. What she didn't realise, though, what she has now not taken account of, is the fact that through the hard work of the police, they can put her in the room. What Lucy Letby said to the police in interview is completely undermined, not only by that image on your screen, but also by her Facebook activity. She searched for the mother of Child D on June 25th, 2015, and more than 3 months later, when in October she did 2 searches for the father. Either she has a very good memory for names, or she was using the handover sheets. Although the handover sheets don't have the parent's name on, do they? And if she has a good memory, then her claim to have forgotten Child D to you was a lie. Why tell that lie? You might ask yourselves, why won't she tell you the truth? Because the truth is bad for her, isn't it? It's bad. When Child D was born, she was 37 weeks gestation. She was over 3 kilograms in weight. She had good APGAR scores, and yet she survived just over 36 hours. Her mum had a difficult time before giving birth on June 20th at 16:01. There's no doubt, is there, ladies and gentlemen, that Child D suffered suboptimal care in the immediate aftermath of her birth. But Lisa Walker had intervened and called for help. When Child D arrived at the neonatal unit at 19:30, her progress was upward. She was heading in the right direction. Because she had breathing difficulties, she was intubated at 22:10, that's tile 40. And Dr. Brunton, the Scotsman, told us about this, and he referred to his notes of the intubation, which you'll find at tiles 34 and 35. By the morning of the 21st of June 2015, exactly 7 years ago today, Child D was intubated at 0900 hours. You'll find that in Kate Bissell's note at tile 105 and Dr. Newby's note at tile 107. By the end of the day shift on June 21st, Dr. Sarah Rylance, tile 158, the witness who gave evidence from Switzerland through the video link, Dr. Rylance told you this. At 1900 hours on June 21st, from what I've documented, she, in other words Child D, was stable with a minimal level of respiratory support in no additional oxygen. She was responsive and she was making good progress and had responded well to the treatment given since entering the neonatal unit. And we can see from Dr. Rylance's note that Child D was on CPAP. She was responsive when she was handled. Her chest was clear. This is a child with pneumonia. Her chest was clear and she had regular respiratory effort. Her abdomen was soft and not distended. You know why I'm telling you that? She was kept on CPAP because when she was taken off, Child D's breathing became irregular. Child D died 9 hours and 25 minutes after that examination. So I'm going to go straight to the night shift on which she died. It was Father's Day 2015, Sunday the 21st of June. Nurse Caroline Oakley became Child D's designated nurse at handover. She gave evidence to you on Friday the 11th of November last year. So Caroline Oakley, designated nurse for Child D, and importantly we say she also had a child in nursery 2, the child OC. The other 2 children in nursery 1 were MRE and JE. Their designated nurse was Lucy Letby. JE is the same JE who was in nursery 3 on the night child C died. So it looks like Nurse B was right about him, doesn't it? So why, thinking back to child C just for a second, why was Lucy Letby ignoring him to go into the family room? But more importantly, in the context of child D's case, the fact that Caroline Oakley had a child in nursery 2 meant, as you know, that she, Caroline Oakley, would have to leave the room from time to time, leaving Lucy Letby alone with child D. On the night shift, until things started to go wrong, Caroline Oakley was happy with child D. She told you that child D was breathing for herself and was stable, and if you look at tile 169, it's J2291 in your hard copy bundle, you will see that child D's observations were all completely normal. Those are Caroline Oakley's words, not mine. To quote again from Caroline Oakley, this is how she described it in the witness box, looking at that chart. She said, quote, "She's breathing beautifully in air and she's saturating. Her oxygen blood saturations of oxygen are 100%, and that's the highest they can be. In a child with pneumonia, what could be better, ladies and gentlemen?" At 21:10 that evening, Dr. Brunton examined child D. His notes are at tile 174. Child D was still 100% saturated on CPAP in air, no additional oxygen. He said things were clinically improving. There was no sign of increased work of breathing or respiratory distress. Child D's abdomen was soft and her bowel sounds were normal. Dr. Brunton said he'd expect bowel sounds to be present and they listened for them in case there were any signs of obstruction. This was a standard clinical examination, and Dr. Brunton's plan was to institute enteral feeds 1 meal every hour. Child D was well enough to start taking milk, and as Dr. Brunton put it, quote, "We should be trying to improve her status by giving milk." There were no problems with child D until Caroline Oakley went on her break at 0100 hours. Just like in the case of child C, child G, child I, child J, child K, and child N. All of whom collapsed when their designated nurse either left the room or went on a break. Caroline Oakley asked Catherine Percival Ward to keep an ear out for child D. After all, Lucy Letby was in the room. But being an experienced nurse, Nurse Percival Ward checked on child D, and the first time she checked her, when Caroline Oakley had gone on her break, she said child D was, quote, "nice and stable and settled." She checked the equipment and she left the room. She checked child D again 10 minutes later, and child D was still settled. She then heard the alarms and went back into nursery 1. And there in nursery 1 was Lucy Letby. It may be, it probably will be, that you will be reminded in due course that in her evidence, Catherine Percival Ward said she couldn't be certain it was Lucy Letby who was in nursery 1. But we say, who else could it have been? Who was it who should have been in the room at that time in nursery 1? Who else had children to care for in that room? Who else didn't have children to care for in any other room? And if we go back to the population distribution at tile 168, if it wasn't Lucy Letby in nursery 1 when Catherine Percival Ward walked in, the only other people it could have been, given that Caroline Oakley was on a break, and it wasn't Catherine Percival Ward, were Nurse C, well, she was in nursery 2, and she said she was alerted to child D's collapse and went to nursery 1, or Elizabeth Marshall, who was a nursery nurse and wouldn't have been working in nursery 1, whose agreed statement was read to you on the 8th of November 2022, in which she made it clear that she wasn't working in nursery 1 and heard about child D's collapse from somebody else. And when she looked into nursery 1, said Elizabeth Marshall, she saw Lucy Letby doing chest compressions on child D, the child she doesn't remember. What Catherine Percival Ward saw was a reddy blue, reddy brown rash on child D. She said that in her 27 years experience at that time, it was a type of rash that she had, you know the rest of the sentence, that she had never seen before. In cross-examination, she was taken to task about her statement, and it was suggested that she had added detail that didn't appear in the statement. What she had said was not in the written statement that had been transposed by the police from the audio recording of her evidence. but it was in the original recording. And she confirmed that when she was shown the transcript of the original recording. What she had said there was that child D had discoloration that was, quote, a mosaic, a motley colour, blotchiness. Caroline Oakley, the designated nurse who was on the break, recorded in the nursing notes that she was called back by Lucy Letby and Catherine Percival Ward. And this is one of those cases, ladies and gentlemen, where the paper records are not straightforward. Can we start with Tile 221, please? I asked Lucy Letby about this in cross-examination, and the questions and answers went as follows. I said to Lucy Letby, can we go to Tile 221, please? There's an entry at 0130. Do you see that? She replied, yes. I then said, whose handwriting is oral secretions ++? She replied, I can't say definitively. I said, whose does it look like? She replied, it could be mine. I said, yes. Why were you writing in Child D's chart if it was you at 0130, if you were not the person looking after her? She replied, it may have been something I documented alongside Caroline Oakley, who's filled in the other columns. I said, yes, but if she's on her break, she can't have filled them in at the time, can she, if she's on her break? She replied, so you mean she's filled them in at 1:30 when she was on her break retrospectively? And I said, well, it all depends, doesn't it? If we move across, please, in the chart towards the right of it, do you see where it says suction PPLL? She replied, yes. I said, whose writing is that? She said, it's not mine. I'd assume it's Caroline Oakley. I then said, well, who is LL in this context? She replied, it would be me. I then said, because I'm suggesting you were, to use Dr. J. Ram's phrase, babysitting Child D. You had, as a matter of fact, been in nursery 1 throughout, hadn't you? She replied, I can't comment on that. I don't know for certain. Do you believe that, ladies and gentlemen? We then went to the neonatal review and we established that at line 122, Lucy Letby had made an entry on JE's chart at 0130 in the same room at the same time that Child D was collapsing. In the chronology, as we were going through the cases, of course, you'll remember this was the 4th case that we dealt with. This was the first time the issue or potential issues, depending on your findings, of falsifying paperwork came up. And you know what happened after that. The observation chart is at tile 193. If we can go to that, please. What we can see is a record that's timed there at 0115, signed by Caroline Oakley. You can see that the previous record is 2430 and the subsequent one is 0230. Something you might have forgotten, I'm sure at least one of you will remember, is that Caroline Oakley told you that she filled in those details at 0115 with details that she had been told by the girls. And which of the girls do you think that was? Who was the only one who was in the room? We suggest that what happened here was that Lucy Letby took the readings whilst Caroline Oakley was on her break, but passed them on to Caroline Oakley to fill them in. It's the only credible explanation for the timings recorded in the paperwork, if and only if you accept the evidence you heard that Caroline Oakley was on her break, as she and others said she was, and which was not disputed in cross-examination on behalf of Lucy Letby. It would follow, wouldn't it, if that's right, if we're right about this, that Lucy Letby deliberately did not note the data for Child D, who we now know was about to collapse. Why? Plausible deniability. The only explanation can be, we suggest, that she didn't want the paperwork to suggest she'd had anything to do with Child D. That explains the tack she took in interview. I don't remember Child D. It explains what she's told you. If we go to tile 201 and we look at an entry timed at 0114, so this is a minute before what we've just seen on the observations chart, we can see that it's unsigned. And so now that you know very well where I'm going with this, I asked Lucy Letby about this in cross-examination. The questions and answers went as follows. I asked Lucy the question, the blood gas for Child D taken at 0114 was done by you, wasn't it? I don't know. That's your writing, isn't it? It could be my writing, yes. Yes, it is. You see where it says 01 and then the 14 in slightly elevated, yes, numbers? That's the way you write these numbers. Yes. You're not the only person, of course, but that's the way you do it. Yes. And that's your writing, isn't it? It looks like my writing, yes. Yes. Why didn't you sign it? Well, that's just an oversight, the same as the gas on the next line down hasn't been signed. It's just an error that happens from time to time. Well, it may be. People do forget to do things, don't they, ladies and gentlemen? Of course they do. On a busy neonatal unit, you would be wholly exceptional if you didn't make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but it's the timing of the errors, isn't it? It's the patterns of the errors. It's the power of circumstantial evidence. Between that blood gas at 0114 and child D's collapse, there's also an entry in the neonatal infusion prescription chart at 0125, which is at tile 203. You'll see that that's signed by Lucy Letby and Caroline Oakley. Caroline Oakley, who wasn't actually there at the time. Caroline Oakley, who couldn't explain it, but we know that she was out of the room on her break at the time. This is clear evidence, isn't it, that Lucy Letby, in the absence of Caroline Oakley, gave an intravenous infusion to child D 5 minutes before she collapsed, and whilst the designated nurse was on a break. Access to the intravenous line in a case where the experts say death came about as a result of air embolus. Caroline Oakley gave similar evidence of what she saw on child D to what Catherine Percival Ward said, and she made a record in the nursing notes. If we go to tile 207, we will see it. She saw a rash on child D that she had, quote, never seen before in her 20 years of experience. And what she described in evidence was this. I hadn't seen that rash before on a baby I've looked after in my years of neonates, over 20 years. I remember it as a deep red-brown, different than mottling, different to what I've seen before. Evidence given to you on November 4th. Dr. Emily Thomas was a very junior doctor at the time, an ST1, so starting out on her specialist career. Her statement was read to you on the 8th of November last year. What Dr. Thomas, in her agreed evidence, said was this. I remember child D had an unusual episode where she came out in a rash. This occurred about 1:30 in the morning. I remember taking a look. I described the rash as almost having the appearance of a meningococcal type rash. It was purple in colour and mainly over the abdomen. Andrew, which is Dr. Brunton, called the consultant Dr. Newby for advice. She came into the unit and reviewed the care and added an extra antibiotic into child D's treatment. Child D seemed to settle down and the rash appeared to fade. But Dr. Thomas wasn't being influenced by anybody else, was she? And yet she there gives you a remarkably similar description to the descriptions you've heard from many other people. Dr. Brunton gave evidence on the 7th of November. Tile 214 is his note. Dr. Brunton remembered attending on child D at 0140. He said that child D's oxygen level or oxygen requirement had gone up and she had developed a rash. If we could just look at his note, please. I think it's tile 214. Quote, nurses noted that became extremely mottled +++. Also noted to have tracking lesions, dark brown black, across trunk. What he, Dr. Brunton, said to you was the way he had written that note suggested that the description given in the note was what the nurses told him. It's obvious, isn't it, from his use of language there, that that's exactly what this is. Now, this is the key, or one of the keys to this particular case, because this explains I don't remember. If Lucy Letby admitted to you and to the police that she remembered child D, she would also have to admit that it was either her or somebody who was in the room with her at the time that gave this description to Dr. Brunton, wouldn't she? Do you remember an answer she gave me from time to time when I was asking her questions about what other people had noted at the time of these collapses and the mottling or the colour or however you want to describe it? I don't remember that being discussed at the time was one of her refrains, wasn't it? Dr. Brunton has actually recorded it here. This is what Lucy Letby saw, and this is why she doesn't want to engage in having to give answers or explanations for what she saw. This is why Lucy Letby says, I don't remember. At that stage, child D's oxygen had to be increased to 60%. There was a slight subcostal recession. But Dr. Brunton had no concern when he actually listened to child D's lungs, and this is significant, we say, in a child whose issue had been pneumonia. Dr. Brunton said he had no concerns about child D's lungs. Her heart was normal, as was the abdominal examination. You can see there in the tile what Dr. Brunton noted about the discoloration. He planned to do a blood gas, then a fluid bolus, and Dr. Newby agreed that she would come in to review. What Dr. Brunton said at this stage of the collapse was this. This was a completely unusual situation that I had never seen before. The changes in the skin, I could not explain it. Yet another doctor. At 0200 hours, Dr. Newby, who gave evidence to you on November 9th, was called in because child D had been so stable and yet had had such a profound desaturation. And when Dr. Newby arrived, child D was actually saturating well. But there were what Dr. Newby described as, quote, 2 bruised areas on her abdomen like evolving purpura, as if they were secondary to sepsis. We're hearing the same thing so often, ladies and gentlemen, aren't we? If you take a step back and try to remember which one's which, it becomes quite difficult. That's the best example we suggest you could have of the power of circumstantial evidence. These things, which these independent doctors are all saying separately, I've never seen this before. It completely foxed me what was going on. Do you remember what we reviewed yesterday? What Dr. Breary saw on the chest of child O a year and a day later? An unusual small rash on child O's chest was how he described it in evidence. Just keeping this on the screen, looking at Dr. Newby's description there, I'll read to you Dr. Breary's description of child O. If you want to find it, it's in the child O sequence at tile 206. He wrote this, small discoloured query purpuric rash on right chest wall. And he said in evidence, quote, it looked like something normally associated with meningitis, a purpuric rash, which is very, very rare in a neonate, like meningitis. Exactly what Dr. Thomas says in her statement about child D. Meningococcal rash, meningitis. So here, a year and a day apart, we have very similar descriptions being given by different consultants and a senior house officer relating to different children, both of whom were suffering unexpected and perplexing collapses at the hand of Lucy Letby. The reason the descriptions are so similar, ladies and gentlemen, is that the causes of the collapses were the same. You'll remember child O also had that liver injury, which was the result of the application of deliberate force. So after the first crash, child D had a good blood gas at 0222, that's tile 219. Dr. Newby told us that she didn't expect child D to have a further problem, or at least not in the way that she, as it happened, did. By 0235, the areas of discoloration had completely disappeared. That's in Dr. Brunton's note at tile 222. But Lucy Letby remained involved in child D's treatment. You'll remember we went through these in cross-examination because I was suggesting that when Lucy Letby was saying to you that she couldn't remember all this, she wasn't telling the truth about it. We've got the bolus at tile 227, that's at 0240. We've got other medications at tile 230 and 231. And at 3 o'clock, child D was crying and desaturated again. That's tile 234. And again, Lucy Letby on the chart of MRE, and this is the neonatal review at line 166, has herself doing something for MRE in the same room at the same time of the second desaturation. So twice now. Can you imagine a child having a life-threatening event and you're a nurse in the same room and you just, I'll just do observations for this child over here. Is that genuine? Are those records genuine? Or as we suggest, is this all part of her attempt to create plausible deniability? Dr. Brunton was called again and made a note at 0315, which is tile 236. And the unusual skin discoloration reappeared. What are the chances, eh? Dr. Brunton said that child D was, quote, quite agitated and upset, which had been unusual for her. But other than the discoloration and the agitation, she then became normal and returned back to air. The third and fatal collapse of child D came an hour later at 03:45. At the time, Dr. Emily Thomas, whose statement was read on the 8th of November, was in room 203 attending to a child who needed a septic screen, and she heard a member of staff shout for help in room 1. You know who Dr. Thomas thought that member of staff was, don't you? It was Lucy Letby. Because Dr. Thomas is the doctor who said that at a later time in the shift she found Lucy Letby very upset. This is Dr. Thomas' words from her statement at the time of the collapse. What Dr. Thomas says is this. At about 4:30 in the morning, I was on the neonatal unit. I was in either room 2 or 3. I was with another baby that I think needed a septic screen. I was in the middle of trying to insert a cannula or reviewing the baby when I heard a member of staff shouting for help in room 1. I'm not sure, but I think the member of staff was a nurse called Lucy. I recall that she had brown hair and was a designated nurse for child D. What could have given her the impression that Lucy Letby was a designated nurse for child D? Quote, this nurse later became very upset in front of me. I believe she had been a designated nurse for child A, who had died on the unit only a couple of weeks previously. I think she said something like, this is my second baby that this has happened to. This tells you a lot in this case, doesn't it, ladies and gentlemen? It tells you that at the time, even Lucy Letby was associating what had happened to child D with what had happened to child A. Because she recognised, didn't she, that other people were associating these events. But yet she claims to you she can't remember. This can't be a mistaken reference by Dr. Thomas to Caroline Oakley, because Caroline Oakley wasn't working on the shift that child A died. So you think about that. If you were worried that might be an explanation, that is not the explanation. And other than Lucy Letby on this shift, the shift that child D died, the only other member of staff who was working when child A had died was Elizabeth Marshall, the nursery nurse. Her statement was read to you, and what she did was act as a scribe during resuscitation, because she wasn't sufficiently qualified to do anything else. On this final occasion, child D was in cardiac arrest. She wasn't breathing. She had lots of secretions. Dr. Brunton intubated her. He got a positive capnograph result, good chest movement again. There then followed 6 doses of adrenaline, all to no avail. According to Dr. Brunton, he had never seen a baby behave in this manner prior to this or after this. He's now a consultant in the biggest hospital in Glasgow. In cross-examination, he was asked about child D's sodium levels and blood gases, and he told you something that many of the medics have said. Everything must be looked at in clinical context. He was struck, was Dr. Brunton, by child D's precipitous collapses, followed by remarkable recoveries, followed by periods of stability. And again, something which is wholly unusual generally, but tragically not uncommon in the cases that you are considering. What Dr. Brunton didn't say, because Dr. Brunton didn't know, was that the circumstances of child D's collapse were so similar to the circumstances of the collapses of many of the other children in this case. A similarity, as I've already said, which Dr. Thomas, if you accept what she says, records being spoken about, even by Lucy Letby at the time. We say that that similarity makes it all the more remarkable and all the more likely to be the result of sabotage. It tells you that Lucy Letby is lying when she says she doesn't remember child D. At first blush, the interviews in child D's case are unremarkable. But they do, we suggest, contain 1 or 2 interesting remarks. Lucy Letby began by saying that she didn't remember child D. If you want references for that, they are pages 2 and 4. We say you should contrast that with evidence that she gave in answer to questions from her own counsel on the morning of May 2nd, the first day she gave evidence. Then, when she was being asked about the effect of deaths on the unit on the staff, she said without any hint of irony, "You don't forget things like that, they stay with you." This is the same person whose case is, "I don't remember this child who collapsed 3 times and died in front of me." What was she trying to get you to think, ladies and gentlemen, by "we don't forget things like that, they stay with you"? Is she trying to get a bit of sympathy from you? Give the impression that she was a good nurse? doing the right thing for the right reasons. In the 10th of November interviews, she was asked about the Facebook searches. She accepted she had done them, but couldn't explain why she had done them or what she was looking for. She was asked about messages she had sent to Nurse A. It's in the Child D interviews at page 9. These are the messages where she said she came out in a rash looking like overwhelming sepsis, messed about a bit. Quote, messed about a couple of times and came out in this weird rash, looking like overwhelming sepsis. A child she doesn't remember. She was asked about tile 325. You'll find that at page 10. I think there's an element of fate involved. There's a reason for everything. You know what the reason is in this case, don't you? Tile 349, trying to persuade her colleagues that there's an innocent cause, gaslighting. And I'll make sure I get this quotation right. She was asked the following question. Do you remember at the time, about 26th of June 2015, after Child D's death, were you particularly upset and disturbed by what had happened? She replied, I honestly can't remember. How does that tie in with the evidence that she was giving to you on May 2nd in answer to questions from her own counsel? This is a case, we say, where the text messages tell you an awful lot. Tile 286, please. We had such a rubbish night. Our job is just far too sad sometimes. 287, she received. No, what happened? She replied, we lost Child D. What? But she was improving. What happened? Do you want to chat? I can't believe you're on again. You're having such a tough time. Then we come to the ones I've already quoted to you, messed about a couple of times. Then collapsed and had full resus, so upsetting for everyone. Parents absolutely distraught. Dad screaming. Father's Day 2015. I don't remember Child D. Her approach in interview, ladies and gentlemen, as I said at the beginning, was because my name isn't really on the medical records, I'll get away with simply saying I don't remember. Well, she did remember. She's not prepared to admit it to you, and you will ask yourselves why. This is a case to which Professor Arthur's made an important contribution, we suggest. On Friday, November 11th, when asked about the series of X-rays from the evening of June 20th into the afternoon of the 21st, he said they showed that the, quote, minor infection Child D had in her lung was improving. He then said this, if you were to tell me that this baby was in air for all that time or didn't need any treatment for their infection, that would be consistent. And that is the clinical picture, isn't it? Of the post-mortem pictures, Professor Arthur said that the line of gas in one of the main vessels was, quote, highly unusual. And he had also seen it in the cases of Child A and Child O. He told you that he had never seen this quantity of air in the great vessels of a baby when no reason for it could be found. And in the absence of sepsis, which you know can be excluded, he thought that intravenous injection of air was an explanation that needed to be considered. Dr. Marnaridis said this, quote, infection would not explain Child D's death. In his experience, babies with congenital pneumonia would settle unless they were overtaken by sepsis, and he excluded sepsis in this case. As to the gas in the great vessels, he said that the delay between death and the X-ray was not long enough for there to have been any significant decomposition of Child D's body, and therefore that does not explain the gas. His view was that on the balance of the evidence that he was considering, Child D was killed by an air embolus. Dr. Marnaridis doesn't consider lies to the police, doesn't consider lies from the witness box, doesn't consider the similarity with other cases, doesn't consider the alteration of medical records, doesn't consider the position of somebody who gives the appearance of recording observations for another child in the same nursery at the time that this child is suffering fatal collapses. They are all features which you can take into account. It is the power of circumstantial evidence. Dr. Bowen reviewed all the evidence in the notes relating to Child D's short life. She made the point that Child D was born in good condition. Her pneumonia had stabilised and she was recovering at the time of her fatal collapse. She thought, this is Dr. Bowen, that the speed of Child D's collapses and recoveries were very unusual and not indicative of infection. She described them as perplexing and having no clear cause. And having excluded the alternatives, she attributed the collapses and death of child D to an air embolus. She said that the requirement for such extreme intervention in the absence of some disease process at play, child D's distress, the rash, the disappearance of the rash, and the air in the great vessels were all features which tended to support her opinion. And she rejected the idea that taking child D off CPAP had contributed to her death. Dr. Evans reviewed the notes and the medical evidence. He agreed with the view expressed by the treating physicians that child D was recovering from pneumonia at the time she died. You'll remember Professor Arthur's view. Dr. Evans' view was that this was a case of air embolism, and he said that having excluded pneumonia, air embolism was the only viable cause of death. The reasons he gave were: first, there was intravenous access in place; second, the discoloration attested to by the witnesses; third, the failure of resuscitation; and fourth, the presence of air in the great vessels shown in the radiographs. One of the things that Dr. Evans was challenged about was the blood gas recorded at 0140, the one that was unsigned, and the one that you may think Lucy Letby admitted having made in the witness box. Well, we say that if you think about that blood gas can never help Lucy Letby. And in any event, it was dealt with by Dr. Bowen in her report, and she told you that the blood gas was satisfactory.